You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 26th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. This is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
I want peace for my people, real peace and just peace. And I'm asking for your support from all nations of the world.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, speaking at the United Nations General Assembly yesterday, will examine what's been happening at the meeting of world leaders in New York. China has test-fired an intercontinental ballistic missile into international waters. We'll have the details. Then...
We want to be a place that people come to for style and hospitality and all of those things, but also for debate and for journalism that confronts the kind of issues of the day, really. And I think that's the idea behind this essay section.
We'll give you a preview of the contents of the latest issue of Monocle Magazine. We'll hear all about the largest mobility fair in the world, and we'll have a roundup of tourism and culture news too. That's all coming up here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. President Vladimir Putin has warned the West that Russia could use nuclear weapons if it was struck with conventional missiles, and that Moscow would consider any assault on it supported by a nuclear power to be a joint attack. Taiwan's defense ministry says it detected a surge of Chinese warplanes flying off its east, west and south coasts in what a security source said was China simulating attacks to prevent foreign forces helping during a conflict. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau easily survived a vote of confidence on Wednesday after his main political rival failed to muster enough support to end 9 years of Liberal Party rule. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, we begin the show looking at the United Nations General Assembly. Yesterday, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine addressed the world leaders present, and the Security Council held an emergency meeting on Lebanon, with many countries calling for an immediate ceasefire. Well, I'm joined now here in the studio by Burcu Ozcelik, who is a senior research fellow for Middle East security at RUSI, the security and defence-focused think tank, and by Marion Messmer on the phone, senior research fellow in international security at Chatham House. Welcome both. Thank you very much for coming in, Burcu. Let's begin with the emergency meeting. It was called by Slovenia, president of the 15-member council for September. The UN says more than 90,000 people have been displaced in Lebanon since Monday. Almost 600 have died as Israel's military carries out a new wave of extensive strikes in southern Lebanon and in the Bekaa area. In his farewell address to the UN, the US outgoing President Joe Biden warned against a full-scale war in Lebanon. He called for a diplomatic solution. Burcu, is the Security Council any closer to a diplomatic solution? What happened in that meeting?
I'm afraid I'm quite pessimistic on this, and that we're not very close to any type of political settlement. We saw yesterday a joint statement by the US and France calling for, in broad strokes, what would look like a 21-day temporary ceasefire that would come into effect on the Israel-Lebanon border. And the thinking here is that the 21 days would allow a sufficient time to negotiate a political settlement for the border area to prevent further escalation. We are now at the most concerning and critical stage of the conflict that has been ongoing for almost a year now, since the horrific attacks of 7th of October.
And all sorts of appalling atrocities going on, not only there, but around the world. In fact, this is what the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said at the beginning of the week.
International human rights and humanitarian law are clear. All parties must distinguish between civilians and combatants at all times. Attacks on civilians or protected infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, are prohibited. Indiscriminate attacks are prohibited. Attacks where the likelihood of civilian death is disproportionate to the probable military advantage are prohibited. Forced displacement is prohibited. The taking and holding of hostages is prohibited. The use of civilian human shields is prohibited. Collective punishment is prohibited. The use of sexual violence as a weapon of war is prohibited. And violations by one party do not absolve the other from compliance.
Guterres then went on to announce the launch of a system-wide United Nations agenda for protection, under which UN bodies will act as one to prevent human rights violations and to identify and respond to them when they take place. Marion, every one of the acts he said are prohibited are being perpetrated every single day, particularly in Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza and Lebanon. How can the UN enforce this?
That's going to be really difficult for them. I think part of the problem, of course, is that some of the states that are responsible for some of these attacks are in really prominent positions in the UN system. So, for example, Russia in the Security Council, and that makes enforcement incredibly difficult. At the same time, UN institutions do have a lot of power and a lot of normative power in a way. So I think it sets a really important signal that the UN is taking it seriously and that UN institutions are going to do their best to, at the very least, monitor and record some of these atrocities, because part of the problem often is that if you haven't got a good record, it makes it that much harder to then try and do something about human rights violations after a war. So that sets up a stage for the potential of having a lot of prosecutions in the international legal system at some point in the future when some of these conflicts might have ended.
But Burcu, what does it mean for world order if these rules are consistently ignored?
Well, it's very worrying. And even beyond that, it puts into question the moral superiority of the so-called Western or international liberal rules-based order. And when you look at the view from within the regions that are inflicted with these protracted conflicts and the day-to-day grueling reality of having to live amidst these tensions, the view from the Middle East, for example, in many countries in the region, is that the West simply does not have sufficient resolve, commitment to back up its very lofty and ambitious rhetoric. I mean, what we just heard from Guterres is very well structured, very well said, based firmly in international humanitarian law and the principles and values on which our international community is and should be based. But when we look at how that translates into action on the ground and enforcement, importantly, there just is a gap that is growing and very concerningly for the people who are most closely in proximity to the violence that's being inflicted upon their lives.
Marion, Volodymyr Zelensky spoke yesterday. He also issued warnings about the global consequences from Russia's aggression. What did he say?
Well, so first of all, he called for the continued support of the global community, something that continues to be incredibly important for Ukraine, especially at a time when the fight in eastern Ukraine has been dominated by Russia pushing ahead, and various Ukrainian military leaders are concerned about how tired their forces are and how much easier it is for Russia to regenerate their military. Zelensky also mentioned that he is incredibly worried about Ukraine's energy infrastructure because Russia has been continuing to attack Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which is a particular concern given that we're going into autumn and winter, and that could impact on people's abilities to heat their homes and so on. So it could be not just demoralizing, but also dangerous. And then finally, he connected that to Russia's continued occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and also mentioned that there was a concern that Ukrainian intelligence had that Russia might potentially attack other nuclear power plants as well. So Ukraine has a lot of nuclear power plants and relies heavily on nuclear energy for its energy security. And so this could be a way for Russia to undermine stability in Ukraine. But he also, of course, wanted to raise the worry that other European states have certainly shared about some sort of a nuclear disaster that might result from an attack on a power plant. So those were some of the through lines of his argument. A lot of concern about Ukraine's future, an appeal for continued support, and especially a concern about Ukraine's energy infrastructure.
Around the same time, of course, Putin's issued a dire warning to the world. Marion, I wonder if you can unpick his remarks about using nuclear weapons if Russia was struck with conventional missiles.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, first of all, one of the things I thought was so interesting was that his announcement, which was done through a sort of televised meeting with a few of his own major security advisors and leaders, was broadcast from Moscow. So Putin hadn't actually traveled to be in New York for the UN General Assembly meeting. And I mean, it's not that unusual for leaders to miss it. There are a range of different people representing different countries at the foreign minister level, at the head of state level. You have a range there. But given that Zelensky is there in person, it is just interesting that Russia, first of all, timed the release of their doctrinal update to be just after Zelensky's speech, but also that Putin actually hadn't traveled to be there in person, because there were some rumors floating around whether some of these remarks might actually be made at the Security Council. But it turns out that Russia chose to do this remotely. And what I was struck by was that there wasn't actually a lot of substantial change in Russia's nuclear doctrine. So Russia previously already had a line in there about being able to use nuclear weapons if they felt that the survival of the state was at risk. So that's, of course, very vague language. You could potentially argue that the survival of the state is at risk if Moscow is attacked conventionally, but in a very heavy way. So I think that this is, of course, a concerted effort by Russia to essentially spell out some of their red lines in a little more detail, to also impact on the discussion that's currently going on in a lot of European states about how Ukraine is allowed to use some of the weapons that have been delivered, especially the long-range weapons, which Ukraine would really love to use against Russia on Russian territory. But of course, Putin is basically implicitly saying, if you do that, there's a risk that we might use nuclear weapons to retaliate. And the other aspect that I thought was really interesting was that Belarus was also mentioned as being essentially under Russia's extended nuclear umbrella. This is something that Russia essentially is borrowing from NATO, from the US, where that has been long-standing practice. But it's new for Russia to spell it out in such detail. And it's also something that Russia has actually complained against being US practice. So it's interesting that they're now mirroring that practice. But generally, I would say, actually, there is a lot of continuity there. And it's just interesting to see how Putin has clearly carefully chosen the wording to speak to the current political debate that's going on in Europe about how Ukraine is allowed to use certain weapon systems that have been delivered by Western states.
But Burcu, both Russia and Israel have representatives at the UN General Assembly. I wonder how they've responded to these near unanimous calls for peace.
I think when we look at the situation on the Israel-Lebanon border, both sides refusing to return to the status quo that prevailed before the 7th of October. The issue is that both Israel and Hezbollah have very different visions for what the new normal will look like. There has been calls by many countries for an immediate ceasefire in Israel on the Lebanese border. The concern now, of course, is that as escalation continues, Israel, the IDF, may launch a ground incursion across the border. And this would unleash a new chapter of violence and displacement and civilian casualties that would far exceed, and already numerically had the death toll is competing with what we saw in 2006 in the Israel-Lebanon war at that time. So now we're faced with a serious escalation of a scale that we haven't yet witnessed. The immediate calls for a ceasefire, the issue there, of course, the U.S. has come out against that statement being issued yesterday. And here we go back to the argument about drawing a moral equivalency between Israel on one hand and Hezbollah on the other, which has been designated as a terrorist organization by various states. And so the question then is, if this is a call for a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, the caretaker government in Lebanon, how and to what extent will it be in a position to assert influence and leverage over Hezbollah to pull it back from the brink of further attacks deeper into Israel? We saw one attack that went as far as Tel Aviv yesterday, which was, from Hezbollah's perspective, a sort of declaration of victory. It wasn't necessarily a bid to escalate further, but perhaps more tactical ploy to demonstrate that it still had the capability to strike and deeper into Israel than it has done before. But the issue is, who has leverage over Israel, over Hezbollah? All well and good to issue statements that call for an immediate ceasefire and to put on the table this now 3-week proposal during which parties are aimed to come together to talk about what a political settlement would look like, but without sufficient leverage on the parties involved and a concrete, tangible plan for the border, whether that involves Hezbollah retreating 10 kilometers from the Israel-Lebanese border, whether that entails the full implementation, enforcement of UN Resolution 1701, back to the Litani River. That remains to be seen. We don't know enough about the details of what the proposal yesterday looks like.
Burcu, thank you very much indeed. That's Burcu Ozcelik of RUSI and Marion Messmer of Chatham House. And this is The Globalist. It's 14:17 in Beijing, 7:17 here in London. Beijing has announced that it successfully launched an intercontinental ballistic missile yesterday. And although it said the test launch was routine, it's believed that this is the first time an ICBM has been launched into international waters by China. Well, this came as Taiwan's defense ministry said it had detected a surge of Chinese warplanes flying off its east, west and south coasts. To tell us more, I'm joined by Steve Tsang, who's a director of the China Institute, SOAS, at the University of London. Steve, welcome back to the show. Can you tell us more about the missile itself, this ICBM?
Well, the Chinese government are testing long-range missiles, so it is a full ICBM itself. We don't really know very much about exactly what type of missile it is. It is likely to be a new missile that they are testing.
But it looked like it was one designed to be mobile, just from where it was fired from, we understand.
Yes, and it is designed to be able to reach the United States.
Were neighbouring countries warned?
I think there were some countries that were being advised that the Chinese were conducting a test. But I don't think the United States were being warned.
So, as we've been hearing that the United Nations General Assembly is taking place at the moment, was the timing of this launch significant?
No, I don't think so. I don't think they were being timed for the test in order to happen at the time of the UN. I think the Chinese basically decided that they have every right to do whatever they want to do, including testing an ICBM when they want to do it, and therefore the fact that the UN is meeting is really neither here nor there. Let's also not forget that the Chinese are fairly confident that they usually enjoy pretty strong support at the UN, particularly at the General Assembly.
I wonder if this is also linked, though, to the reports of increased activity of Chinese warplanes around Taiwan.
Yes and no. I don't think they are directly related. The test is not necessarily because they are increasing activities around Taiwan. They've been increasing activities around Taiwan for a while. But ultimately, the test is meant to let the Americans know that China's deterrence capability, nuclear deterrence capability, is substantially increasing. And that deterrence is meant to deter the Americans from interfering when China eventually decides to use force against Taiwan.
Because, of course, its nuclear build-up is continuing. Does it go beyond credible minimum deterrence, the smallest strategic arsenal needed to prevent attacks? Is China exceeding that?
Well, China's nuclear arsenal before Xi Jinping was just over 200 warheads. And in the last decade or so, it has been more than doubles to 500 or over 500. So you can see that there is a substantial increase in the kind of numbers they have. But compare that to the Americans or the Russians who have over 5,000 warheads each, then even your 500 warheads that the Chinese have is still quite small. Is it enough to deter the Americans? Probably not yet, given the change in the technologies there is. But there is always the issue of not whether the Chinese nuclear deterrence is one that can mutually assure destruction with the United States, but whether the Americans are willing to trade Los Angeles for Taipei, for example.
Now, Reuters published a leaked intelligence report yesterday saying that Russia had established a weapons program in China to develop and produce long-range attack drones for use in the war against Ukraine. If this is the case, would Beijing then be subject to international sanctions? And why then? What is the driver for it to want to do so?
Well, this is a really good question, because the sanction regime so far in place says basically that countries that provide lethal weapons to Russia could be subjected to secondary sanctions. The Reuters report is not really sufficient to show clearly that the Chinese are providing lethal weapons to Russia. China may be, and we don't know whether it is for sure yet, because there's only the Reuters report, that China may be involved in helping the Russians to develop drones. And the Chinese will almost certainly claim that the drones that they are helping the Russians to develop are for civilian use rather than for military use. The fact that it has a capacity for payload, they can claim that is perhaps meant to use for camera or weather monitoring equipment. If the Russians subsequently use them for other purposes, that's not what they were intending to help. The Chinese government does not want to be subjected to secondary sanctions. The regime is not clear enough that it will immediately trigger secondary sanctions.
Reports like this are usually leaked for a purpose. Why would the intelligence agencies who pass this story on to Reuters want to have it in the media right now?
Well, the US has been warning China not to provide military assistance or assistance that will have clear military purposes for Russia recently. But they have not said that the provision of such support will trigger secondary sanctions. So the likelihood is that whoever leaked the information would like to force the government in Washington to be clearer that actions like that probably should result in sanctions, so that they can stop the Chinese from helping the Russians at the relatively early stage. Because even according to the Reuters report, we are at the moment looking at a handful of drones having been built and hand over to the Russians. So they are potentially still at the testing stage rather than at the production stage.
Steve, thank you very much indeed. That's Steve Tsang there. Now, still to come on the programme, Monocle's Laura Kramer is fresh off the plane from Berlin, and she'll tell us all about the largest mobility fair in the world. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers, and joining me in the studio is the journalist Terry Stiastny, who has fought the bitter weather to get here.
This is not nice out there. It is absolutely pouring with rain and really feels not autumnal, even wintry it suddenly feels today.
Yeah, just gross.
It's dark. It's getting dark.
Dark and wet. Dark night of the soul for the mayor of New York. He's been indicted.
Yes, well, this is sort of broken overnight. I think the New York Times were the first to report this. Yes, they are reporting that Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, is being indicted on suspected federal corruption charges. And they say the indictment is due to be unsealed today. So it's not clear exactly what potential charges he is facing, but it's believed that this is to do with whether he possibly conspired with the Turkish government to receive illegal foreign donations, the New York Times is reporting. Now, Mayor Adams has issued a video about this. He issued a statement last night saying he had done nothing wrong. He said, "I always knew if I stood my ground for New Yorkers, I would be a target, and a target I became. If I am charged, I'm innocent, and I will fight this with every ounce of my strength and spirit."
But I mean, he's been in trouble for a while, hasn't he? There have been all sorts of investigations into his administration.
Yes, there seem to have been a lot of investigations, particularly into his relationship with the Turkish government. There was a controversy over a consulate building of the Turkish government. They're looking into whether he accepted flights and upgrades on Turkish airlines. This possibly also involves other countries as well. And this inquiry has been secret apparently until late last year when the FBI searched his chief fundraiser's home. So yes, this seems to be an investigation that is going on for a while. But, it couldn't come at a worse time for New York. I mean, literally, you've been hearing about the UN General Assembly, and you know how New York is always absolutely packed full of world leaders, and it's usually sort of chaos and everything's kind of shut down. And then so you've got all the world leaders there, including the president of Turkey arriving at the UN General Assembly as well. And then suddenly having this controversy and potential indictment of the mayor is not great for the city.
No, certainly not. Now, Keir Starmer's in New York too, but he's coming back into a firestorm.
Yes, I know this is quite interesting because The Guardian has reported, so we've just had the Labour Party conference in the UK, and Keir Starmer trying to come out of it. There's all sorts of questions about, the donations that he had received, questions about how the Downing Street operation is functioning in the beginning of this new government. And he hasn't really managed to put that behind him after the party conference. So The Guardian is reporting this morning that the Prime Minister has become exasperated about the infighting across government. And the key figure here is Sue Gray, who is the Downing Street Chief of Staff. You'll remember that she was also a former civil servant who looked into propriety and ethics, and particularly the Boris Johnson Partygate allegations. And she seems to be bumping heads with a lot of other people within Downing Street. And there seems to be a bit of a fight going on, partly for access to the Prime Minister. So I would say that the thing is, it's her job. It's the job as the Chief of Staff to not let people get access to the Prime Minister. And there is always someone saying, he's busy now, go and talk to somebody else about this. And, inevitably the people who are told go and talk to someone else, not the Prime Minister, tend to be unhappy about it. But it's the amount of briefing, I think, that is going on about this, and particularly when the Cabinet Secretary, who's the top civil servant in the British government, is also sort of about to be on the way out of the door. Can you really afford to lose potentially two of your key people in Downing Street at a time when you're trying to get to grips with things?
And people are also very upset that she actually earns more than the Prime Minister.
Well, yes. And this is, again, she only earns sort of a touch more than the Prime Minister because she's on a civil service salary. But again, again, people have sort of kicked off about this, partly because I think, we don't pay our politicians in the UK all that much money. But the trouble is the special advisors, the sort of the more junior political staff who have come into government have been told you've got to take a pay cut. And they're usually the people who are responsible for briefing the media about what's going on. So if you've told all the people who are usually speaking to the media in pubs and around Westminster, yes, you guys do need to take a pay cut, it's not surprising that some of them are quite unhappy about this because, they're the ones who are supposed to be putting out the message and they are a little bit disgruntled, it appears.
Absolutely. Now, a man who never made it to Prime Minister but is the head of something now, the new editor of The Spectator.
Yes, I think this is quite interesting. This was announced yesterday. Michael Gove, a former cabinet minister in many roles, who stood down just before the last election, deciding that he had enough. And he's gone into, I suppose, what is a quite traditional job for kind of current or former Conservative MPs. So The Spectator has been taken over by a new company. There's been a bit controversy about, the ownership of it. They have moved out Fraser Nelson, who was the editor there for about 15 years, and put Charles Moore in as the chairman, who, again, former editor of the Daily Telegraph. But I actually think this is kind of the job that you can imagine Michael Gove doing. He's in a kind of tradition of people from Nigel Lawson to Boris Johnson to way back further in the 60s. And I think he'd probably actually getting out of politics and running a magazine that's usually like the voice of the Conservative Party is probably something I imagine he would enjoy very much.
And of course, he does come from a journalism background.
Yes, he does. And so, he was a journalist before he went into politics. And again, someone who has always enjoyed talking to journalists and broadcasting and writing. So it'll be interesting to see what direction he takes it in, because of course we don't know, who the next leader of the Conservative Party is. Is this going to be something that is kind of boosting the Conservative Party, or is it going to be something that's more critical on the sidelines? And I think that very much depends who the leader will be.
Let's go to Madrid now, and this wonderful, wonderful exhibition that is going to be starting once all the nuts and bolts of quite a complex arrangement, it looks like, have been sorted out.
Yes, this sounds fascinating. It says that apparently the Times is reporting today that 70 masterpieces from one of the world's greatest private collections, the collection of the Spanish billionaire businessman Juan Antonio Perez Simón, is going to feature in a new exhibition at Madrid City Hall Cultural Centre, going to be on until January the 12th for anyone who's going to Madrid. The largest private collection of Victorian art to be found outside Britain, alongside non-British arts, so El Greco, Bruegel, Gauguin, Dali, and it sounds absolutely amazing. I think it's just really interesting that he has decided to do this as a free loan to Madrid, which obviously has got huge art collections and amazing art galleries already, and they want to turn this now into a permanent exhibition. So they're going to create a new cultural centre, measure up to any great museum, 4,000 square metres, 200 works at a time. So there's going to be, anyone who is going to Madrid is going to have even more art to go and see. It's going to require a longer trip, I think.
Yeah, and he's got some fantastic stuff in there. Just having a look through, I'm very, very tempted to go and see it immediately. Now, lastly, why would you want to cover yourself or cover your loved one after they'd passed, as they say, in cheese?
Well, I think, perhaps we are going to find out more about this, because apparently this is what they did in the tombs in the Taklamakan Desert in northwest China 3,600 years ago. And the Times is reporting on the archaeologists who have discovered this. They were found in the 1930s. In 2014, it's taken a long time to work out that the crumbs on these mummies were actually cheese. And apparently this is now the oldest known specimen of cheese. But as you say, why was there... This is a question that is not answered in the article, and probably will take years and several PhDs or something to discover this. Why were people buried with cheese? Was there no cheese in the afterlife? Did they need to take the cheese with them? But I think there's going to also start a potential argument here, because it's going to be who invented kefir. So I think they're saying that this is basically like modern day kefir in northwest China. It has existed since the Bronze Age. And they're now saying that, look, no, we possibly invented kefir rather than the Russian North Caucasus. So you can imagine that, people are very jealous of their cultural food inventions. And I think if people say the Chinese discovered cheese before the Caucasus region did, there could be a big row about this.
And they've managed to extract the DNA and so on. I mean, they're really learning a lot about
work out that there was both sheep's cheese, I think, and goat's cheese, but they weren't mixed together, that they were kept separate, and it is very much like modern day kefir. Sorry, cows and goats, not sheep's. They produced cheese from using milk from both cows and goats, but did not mix them. So, I liked all great civilizations have obviously had good cheese.
Terry, thank you very much indeed. That's Terry Stiastany there. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. President Vladimir Putin warned the West on Wednesday that Russia could use its nuclear weapons if it was struck with conventional missiles, and that Moscow would consider any assault on it supported by a nuclear power to be a joint attack. The decision to change Russia's official nuclear doctrine is the Kremlin's answer to deliberations in the United States and Britain about whether or not to give Ukraine permission to fire conventional Western missiles into Russia. Taiwan's defence ministry says it's detected a surge of Chinese warplanes flying off its east, west and south coasts in what a security source said was China simulating attacks to prevent foreign forces helping during a conflict. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau easily survived a vote of confidence on Wednesday after his main political rival failed to muster enough support to end 9 years of Liberal Party rule. Trudeau, whose popularity has slumped amid unhappiness over rising prices and a housing crisis, became more politically vulnerable this month when the smaller New Democratic Party tore up a 2022 deal to keep him in power until an election scheduled for the end of October 2025. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. The new issue of Monocle Magazine is out today, a bumper October edition, nearly 300 pages long. And to find out more, Chris Chermak spoke with Monocle's foreign editor, Alexis Self.
Lex, we're going to be talking about the October issue of Monocle Magazine. We're going to start with the cover. It feels like you're trying to make a point with this issue. New, neu, nouveau. I mean, this is, it's new.
It's new. It's new in English, German and French. Yeah, it is new. I mean, you pick it up. We've both got a copy right here.
We do. You're flipping through it. Almost 300 pages of it.
Almost 300 pages of global reporting. And, Monocle magazines always look sumptuous. But this one is particularly bursting with different formats and photography, illo, reports from all over the world. We've got news sections. We've got a glossy essay section with some hard-hitting stuff in it and some more fun stuff, of course. We have a kind of illoed chart looking at national dress around the world for all our listeners and readers who remember wall charts which had the different national dress on them from their childhood. And this is a piece exploring how there has been a revival in national dress after a few decades, perhaps, where it was seen as a kind of source of amusement or embarrassment or cultural appropriation. We look at 5 places where it's having a revival, and we have an illoed wall chart next to it.
Would this be part of the style section, which is always big in the October issue as well?
This is our annual style special, and that takes up a lot of editorial real estate. There's some wonderful,
it does, as it should.
As it should, and it looks beautiful. There's some fashion shoots and there's interviews and kind of guides to what to wear this season. Listeners won't know that I'm currently jacketed. Because,
you are, which I suppose,
has...
exactly. This is the fall issue. You are jacketed appropriately for the increasingly cold London that we're in. But to be fair, Lex, I don't want to take you too much out of your foreign editor remit. We'll probably get Natalie Theodosi, our fashion director, on this show or another one to go in depth on the style section, style special of this magazine. But tell us more about the essay section. I'm curious in particular. What do you get the sense? What were the discussions here about why to go for that? Why now? And give us a couple of the sort of topics that are being discussed.
With this essay section and the whole idea of the magazine, which is a Gesamtkunstwerk, I think, is to kind of present an optimistic view of the world and also to put forward our intent to, present people with a kind of repository of all there is to know about everything that matters, or rather a kind of selection, an editorialized selection of, and the essay section is part of that. We want to be a place that people come to for style and hospitality and all of those things, but also for, debate and for journalism that confronts the kind of issues of the day, really. And I think that's the idea behind this essay section, which is glossy, and it has an interview with a US Navy submariner about what can be learned from living underwater for long periods of time, and then pieces on human-centered design, an essay on human-centered design and those buzzwords in the design industry at the moment, and then there's another one on technology's impact on childhood at the moment, and how simple things such as walking to school can have an impact not only on a particular child's development but also on wider society.
And just finally, Lex, speaking of the issues of the day, there is also some focus on the US elections, of course. We will have one more issue that comes out just before the elections on November 5th. But tell us a bit about what's in this issue. We look at media, and we also do a drive with the Dallas PD.
Yeah, again, this election particularly, and we've talked about this before, feels like an election of the internet age. People's attention spans are so short, and every day brings a kind of assault of imagery and sound bites, and it's difficult to get any kind of purchase on it. And one thing that's sold as being massively consequential one minute is then dismissed as being completely inconsequential the next. We want to take a kind of longer view, a more digested view on the election, and part of that was we have a relationship with the city of Dallas. We've been there before. We know the mayor, and we met the chief of police. And Dallas was the only large US city that saw crime fall in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. Now, crime has fallen nationwide since then, but we wanted to find out how they managed to achieve that, because while the debate in lots of US cities was around defunding the police, Dallas actually increased funding for the police during that time and increased police on the beat. So our US editor, Chris Lord, went to Dallas, went on a ride-along with the Dallas Police Department to try and find out how they had achieved those numbers and still kind of maintained and built relations with the community, and also to look at the issue of law and order in this election. And then we have another piece in the culture section of the magazine, where we look at those media influencers ahead of the election. We speak to 5 people, from Katty Kay, who's the host of the podcast The Rest is Politics US, the editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and also a Fox News TV anchor, and talk to them about what they think the big issues are ahead of the election, and what role media will play, both traditional and new media, in the campaign and perhaps in the result.
Alexis Self, Monocle's foreign editor, thank you very much for walking us through the pages of Monocle's October issue on newsstands today. Check it out.
Monocle's Chris Cermak and Alexis Self, thank you very much. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Now, InnoTrans is the world's largest mobility fair. Monocle producer Laura Kramer has been in Berlin for the fair over the last 2 days. She joins me now in the studio, but really only by the skin of your teeth. You nearly didn't join me at all, did you? And that's all down to transport.
That's right. It's air transport, though. My flight was delayed, so I actually didn't get in last night until 1 a.m., Georgina.
Well, thank you for getting up early and coming in to talk to me. Now, what have you been doing for the last couple of days in Berlin?
Oh my gosh, I've been running around InnoTrans, and it is so huge. I spoke about it on the briefing as well. The mass capacity of it is, I can't really explain it. It was my first time. Other people actually, very, veterans who go every time they put it on, they all knew. So they all kind of alluded to this, but there are 27 halls full of innovations from 59 countries, almost 3,000 exhibitors. And this year's was all about the future of mobility. So InnoTrans is always known for the exhibitors presenting their groundbreaking innovations first, but on this one, they were really pushing to grab a lot of attention. And it was also very exciting because, for example, in 2022, it was still kind of coming out of COVID. So China wasn't there, for example, on that occasion, but they came back on this occasion. They had a huge display showing off one of their hydrogen trains as well in the outdoor venue. So it was really exciting to be a part of the buzz of that. I mean, last year, more than 130,000 people were in attendance. I'm really excited to see what the final numbers are going to be for 2024. They still don't know. I asked around. The press office were like, "Ooh, we don't know, but we're very excited to find out."
You mentioned hydrogen trains from China. There were a lot of that sort of thing.
Yeah, because it is looking at the future of mobility, obviously sustainability is going to be a big part of that conversation. So the Saudi Arabia Railway CEO, for example, announced plans to test more hydrogen-powered trains in the kingdom, and there were many hydrogen trains that were also shown. And also, it's hard to oversee the topic of digitalization as well, because if we're thinking mobility of the future, that's at the forefront. The digital transformation, I think, has fully left the station. We're looking at, if we compare things, for example, the conversations that I was having to the car ecosystems, how we have these smart cars built with this iOS and Android ecosystems. What are we doing for trains? And also as a way, of course, to encourage more train travel and public transport in general. And the challenge for this is mostly because, unlike a car, it's different stakeholders, different operators, public funding, of course, is going to be a part of that conversation. So overall, it's making it more attractive for people to use trains, make it more digital. Can we have, for example, apps rather than pressing a button to ask our tram or our train to stop? Can we have an app that says that? Can we have an app or an app that shows how busy the trains are, if we should be traveling at different times? So these are different conversations that are happening. And also at the same time, whether there should be more integration end-to-end for customers. So rather than having to buy different tickets, you can have one journey with one QR code. And that also includes some different types of transport aside from trains.
There was a big vehicle showcase.
Yeah, so aside from the 27 halls, there's also an outdoor display, which is where they showcase all these trains. And actually, on my first day there, it's kind of embarrassing. I looked over and I thought to myself, wow, the train station is so close to the event. No, that was actually just part of the display. They were presenting over 130 vehicles, actually, of different train carriages. And this is like multiple units to high-speed trains, road rail vehicles, wagons, everything in between. And in between them, it was really nice. They were interspersed with these tents where people were having beers. And despite the cold and the rain, people were still out there enjoying a little pint.
And I just wonder about, you're talking about, the mechanical side of trains. What about the comfort side? Were the interiors coming on too?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that really stuck out to me. It's a huge part of it because so not only do you have the train components, like we said, the carriages and everything else, but we have everything there on display from washing liquids that are really new for trains, cleaning, painting, new paints, of course, the comfort and different seats. You could try out all these different seats in different venues. And it was really shocking to me, actually. There were so many components of train travel that I hadn't even thought about. But then, of course, comfort is a massive part of it. So, they have that. It's all covered, Georgina. Trust me, it's all covered.
But is it covered beyond trains? Are there other kinds of transport there?
Yeah, so again, with the mobility of the future in mind and integrating different ways to have public transport, they did also have a special exhibition area for buses. So that was alternative drive systems and charging solutions. Very exciting stuff. So it brought together all these manufacturers, suppliers, and buyers from the transport communities. And they had some 500-meter demonstration courses on the bus display, too. And people could also not people, drivers could show off their skills. I couldn't get in there and try to drive a bus, unfortunately.
It sounded like you might have needed a bus, though, just to get around the place. Is it too big now, do you think?
I do wonder that, because some of the vendors, especially those who have been there before, said they almost feel like they're getting lost, because especially if you've got media professionals there, and there was actually one railway publications that had 9 people covering it, and I really wonder if that was enough. But they felt at some points they maybe got lost in how much you had to do because of that and all the walking that you do from different sides. You really have to be very intentional with where you're going. And so there was the feeling of that. We also saw some student groups coming through, being shown. I don't know, these might be the future engineers that are going to come up with great alternative green fuels. Very exciting. I'm not sure who exactly they were, but yeah, it was a lot of people. And it did feel, is it manageable at this point? Because do you have enough information desks? Can you direct people to the exits quickly? It was massive.
Yeah, that sounds like it was fun too.
Yes, I got my steps count up. Good exercise.
Laura, thank you very much for joining us. That's Laura Kramer there. And you're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. And finally, on today's show, it's time to get a roundup of travel and culture news. And we'll be focusing specifically on a new Italian programme promoting what's called roots tourism. Well, Noelle Salmi is a travel, culture and sustainability writer, and she joins us down the line from our Zurich studio. Good morning to you, Noelle.
Good morning, Georgina.
What is roots tourism?
Yes, well, as you said, the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation has called 2024 the Year of Roots Tourism. And what it is basically traveling back to the country of your ancestors. It's called the Italia program, and it's designed to connect descendants of Italian immigrants with genealogists, if they'd like, and to help them discover their family roots. It creates bespoke itineraries for them, focusing on the towns and villages of their origin, and it offers cultural programs and has partnered with regions throughout Italy to offer discounts to local events.
So we hear, most of the tourism stories we hear coming out of places like Italy is that there's just too many tourists. Why are they encouraging more?
Well, that's right. And it's an interesting initiative. So Italy's foreign ministry estimates that there are up to 80 million people of Italian descent outside of Italy, and it would like to capitalize on that as a way to bring back the numbers from pre-COVID travel times. But they would like to do it in a more sustainable manner, in a more against the overcrowding. So it's part of a trend of tourism called sometimes second city tourism, where you do want to bring in those tourist dollars, but you want to bring them into regions that aren't totally overcrowded. We know the issues in Venice. And it's believed that most of these descendants came from small towns in southern Italy. So there's a lot of focus on going there. And in fact, right now, Italia is being promoted in Australia, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Canada, and the U.S. And they were just in Montevideo. I'm half Uruguayan. It's where I saw this story of a lovely young Uruguayan man who went back and discovered and met a long-lost cousin of his grandmother, who he said was a copy of her. Uruguay is thought to be 45% of Italian descent. And in a couple of weeks, Italia is going to be in New York City promoting itself, New York has the largest population of Italian descendants outside of in the U.S., and they are largely from southern Italy, so a less explored area.
And of course, what we've also seen in that part of Italy is that little villages are dying. People are moving out. They're offering houses for next to nothing if you promise to renovate and start a business and so on. So this is also going some way to improve that.
That's exactly right. And the other piece of it is that it's bringing dollars into this area. When a traveler comes to Venice, and even if they stay in a hotel, it might be internationally owned. They might shop at an Italian brand that's actually a large international conglomerate. Maybe even the restaurant is not really local. So it is helping to bring tourist dollars or tourist euros to a part of the country that's really going to benefit from it.
Tell us more about efforts to draw tourists to less travelled areas, because this is something, as you say, that people are really concentrating on within the travel industry.
Yes, they really are. During COVID, it was a good time for destinations to really think about what kind of travel they wanted, and they really want to move away from the Instagram-fueled attempt to always have your photograph by the best-known site. So as a travel writer, I've often actually even been asked by destinations to focus on less visited areas. And it's considered as well to be a little bit more authentic, to be a little bit more focused on a cultural experience and really understanding a country rather than just trying to take a picture in front of it. So yes, it is a growing effort. The other thing that is a part of the Italia program is this idea of genealogy-focused tourism. With the advent of cheap DNA testing, more and more people are finding out that they are a little bit Italian, a little bit German, a little bit Ghanaian, and they are interested in visiting these countries. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, Airbnb teamed up with 23andMe, which is a big DNA testing company, to offer trips to travelers based on what they found out about themselves.
That's a really great initiative. It sounds absolutely fascinating. I'm eager to know more about your background, though, being half Uruguayan and living in Switzerland. And of course, your long history within travel. Just give us the potted story, Noelle.
Well, my mother's parents were actually German Jews who left in the 1930s and ended up in Uruguay. And my father is an American who's in Brazil. So I have grown up all over the place, and perhaps that spurred the interest in travel writing. But my mother's now in California, so I'm a little bit all over the place. But it's interesting because this heritage tourism idea actually isn't new. Alex Haley, when he wrote Roots in the 1980s, it actually really spurred an interest by African Americans to go back and understand their roots a bit. And Ghana has been a big, 1 million Americans traveled to Ghana last year, apparently, African Americans to look at their roots. And Israel and Ireland and Scotland have also long been places where people would like to go back and find out more about their forefathers. But the interesting thing about Italia is that they will really help you find out about relatives you didn't even know you had. So records go back to the 1600s in a lot of churches and small towns. So it's a concerted effort to lure back a different kind of traveler.
Well, it sounds absolutely excellent. Noelle, thank you very much indeed. That's Noelle Samley, who was talking to us from our Zurich studio. And that's just about all for today's programme. But our producers today were Chris Chermak and Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Sana Jamani, and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. I'll be with you telling you what those particular tracks are all morning. And then the briefing is live at midday in London. The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. Just before I go, I want to tell you a little bit about our latest edition of Meet the Writers. It's with Imogen Sutton, who was the collaborator and wife of the late animator Richard Williams. And he, of course, was the animator who did Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He did that opening credit on The Pink Panther, and just so much more. And he's got a wonderful new book out telling us all about the greats of animation, including Walt Disney. So that's the latest episode episode of Meet the Writers right here on Monocle Radio. That's it from me, Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.